In Oim Andus by Percy Shelley, the narrator of the poem meets a traveller who tells him about a statue that he saw when he was in a desert. The traveller first noticed two huge stone legs standing without a body. Near the legs, on the sand and partially sunk into the ground, was the head of the statue. On its face, despite being shattered and cracked, was a nasty, arrogant look. The sculptor who made the statue made it look very lifelike. At the foot of the statue was an engraving which read, "My name is Oim Andus, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Clearly, the statue had once stood in the midst of a vast and impressive empire, but that's the irony. By the time the traveller sees the statue, not only is it crumbled and broken, but it's isolated and in the middle of the lonely desert. In London by William Blake, the narrator of the poem describes a walk through the city of London. It's a poem from 1794, so it's not the London we think of today, but the London of King George III. The narrator walks through the streets near the River Thames and notices how everyone he sees looks sad and troubled. The cry of a man, the cry of a child, and every voice he hears make him realise that people are held captive mentally as well as physically. The poem suggests that this suffering is caused by those in power, the church, landowners, the monarchy, and the government. The poem comes from the collection Songs of Experience, which presents a harsh view of a world corrupted by humans. Extract from the Prelude by William Wordsworth tells a true story from Wordsworth's own childhood. It takes place in the Lake District, an area of northwest England famous for its lakes, forests and mountains. The poem describes the poet as a young boy stealing a rowing boat and rowing across Ullswater Lake. Wordsworth, led by nature, which is personified in the poem as her, finds a boat chained up, undoes the chain, gets in and pushes off onto the lake. Proud of his skill, he rows the boat, feeling powerful and delighted with himself. But all this is about to change. As he rows, Wordsworth fixes his eyes on a huge mountain that springs into view. Terrified, he turns and rows back to the shore, harassed for days by the memory of the event. My Last Duchess by Robert Browning is a dramatic monologue in which the Duke of Ferrara, a city in Italy, shows a painting of his former wife, the Duchess, to a guest. The Duke points out the look on his wife's face, a kind of blush or a look of happiness, and he explains how his wife disappointed him by looking not only at him, her husband, in this way, but looking at everyone else in the same way too. Everything impressed her and made her happy. The sunset, some cherries given to her by an admirer, or riding a horse. The Duke was disappointed by this and gave commands, perhaps to have her killed. Near the end of the poem we learn that the Duke is telling this to the servant of a count. The Duke now wants to marry the Count's daughter. Although the Duke thinks he is all-powerful, there's evidence in the poem that he perhaps is not quite as powerful and in control as he thinks. The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Tennyson focuses on part of the Battle of Balaclava that took place on October 24, 1854. The Russians had taken a beating by the British and were retreating. However, as they were retreating, it became clear that they were trying to remove some captured heavy guns. The Light Brigade, made up of lightly armoured troops on horseback, was ordered to ride in to protect the guns. But there was a mix-up in communication somewhere between the three leaders in charge that day. Instead, the Light Brigade launched itself at the enemy artillery at the end of a valley. Rather than chasing off retreating Russian troops, the Light Brigade charged down a valley that was surrounded by heavily armed Russians who were shooting at them. Instead of retreating, the 600-strong Light Brigade bravely kept going. They were committed to it, and they were torn to pieces by gunfire. Even when they got to the end of the valley, those who were still alive were faced with Russians firing musket guns, and the Light Brigade only had their sabres, their swords. Over 150 soldiers were killed and another 150 were injured in what was a tragic, futile mission. The poem praises the bravery and honour of the soldiers. It also questions the leadership blunder that led to the unnecessary death. Exposure by Wilfred Owen describes the poet's World War I experience in trench warfare. In the opening stanza, the poet explains how the soldiers' brains are aching in the freezing cold wind that is hitting them. They're tired, but have to stay awake on watch. Flares flying through the air confuse their memories of the position they're in. They're worried by the lack of sound. They whisper. They're scared, but nothing happens. Much of the poem follows this format until the poet begins to question the point of it all. Ultimately, Owen determines that the soldiers are there because they believe that going to war is the only way to ensure that a loving, domestic life will continue. Their children will also continue to be brought up happy, healthy and protected. Storm on the Island by Seamus Heaney is set in the Aran Islands, a group of 3 islands on the west coast of Ireland. The narrator of the poem begins by describing how well prepared he and others are for a coming storm. They've built their houses short and wide to withstand the powerful wind. They've laid firm foundations and built strong roofs. There's no threat of losing crops they've grown because the earth is so dry that they've never been able to farm in the first place. There aren't any trees either. If there had been trees, they would have kept the islanders company during the storm because of the sounds that are made as the wind blasts through branches and leaves. These sounds allow you to listen to what you're afraid of and to forget that the storm is attacking your house. As the poem progresses and the storm begins, this confidence begins to disappear. The narrator becomes more and more desperate and afraid. Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes is a poem about a World War I soldier. Hughes himself was born in 1930, long after the end of World War I, so the poem's not based on his own personal experience. It's an imagined account. We begin the poem mid-action with a soldier charging towards the enemy, rifle in hand. The soldier's running, stumbling across a field towards a hedge. He can hear the sounds of gunfire, and the horror of the moment pushes aside his original patriotism and replaces it with sheer panic. In the second stanza, the soldier begins to contemplate what he's doing and why he's doing it. He feels there's no point in war. In the third and final stanza, the focus shifts to a hare that has found itself caught up in the midst of the battle. The poet's use of language in the final stanza contains a mocking tone as Hughes criticises the patriotism of soldiers, pointing out that the noble virtues of honour and human dignity, etc. mean little or nothing when you're facing the true horror of war. Remains by Simon Armitage is taken from the poetry collection The Not Dead, a collection of poems about discharged servicemen published in 2008. Remains is based on the true story of Guardsman Tromans, who was a machine gunner in the Iraq War in 2003. In the poem, 3 soldiers were called to clear a bank that was being looted. As the soldiers approached the bank, one of the looters ran out, probably armed, so all 3 soldiers shot him, and the man was taken away, but the bloodstain remained on the ground, and the soldier saw it week after week when he patrolled the area. Eventually, the soldier went home on leave. Now we learn that he could not get rid of the image of the man he shot. The soldier begins to abuse drink and drugs to try and forget the image, but he cannot get it out of his head. Poppies by Jane Weir is a dramatic monologue in which, as Weir herself states, I wanted to write a poem from the point of view of a mother and her relationship with her son, a child who was loved. The son has seemingly joined the army, and the poem begins with the mother noticing how, 3 days before Remembrance Day, people had already placed poppies on the graves of soldiers who died in the war. This reminds her of how, before her son left, she had pinned a poppy onto his blazer. She remembers how she had smoothed down her son's collar and had tried not to look upset. She had wanted to Eskimo kiss him like when he was little and had to hold back from running her hands through his hair. Later, the mother followed a dove to a war memorial, leaning on it, hoping to hear her son's voice. There's some ambiguity in this poem. Is the son dead? Is he at war? But what really matters is what the poem tells us about power and conflict. Poppies looks at the effects of war on those who are not themselves at war. War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy opens with a photographer coming home from a trip. Finally alone, he's in his dark room setting out his equipment, and he thinks about the different places that he's been to. In stanza 2, he starts to develop the pictures. He's reminded of the contrast between the war zone he's been to, taking these photographs, and rural England that he comes home to. In stanza 3, a picture's beginning to develop. He thinks about the death of the man in the photograph and the cries of the man's wife. And in the final stanza, the photographer realises that the people in England who look at these war photographs in a Sunday newspaper will be sad only for a moment, then they'll forget and carry on with their lives again. The poem ends with the war photographer flying out to a war zone. In the 1998 Channel 4 programme Password, Carol Ann Duffy said, "Those photographs are in the background, but I'm more interested in the photographer, in the dilemma of someone who has that as a job, to go to these places and come back with the images." Tissue by Imtiaz Darker begins by exploring how paper, initially thin tissue paper, can change things. It can alter things, and as such it has power. Darker describes the paper in religious books or family histories in which details of a baby's life are written. Paper has power when it is used to divide and to mark out, to segregate, to order, or to control. Darker explores how paper seems to have power in commerce through receipts which control money in finance. But it's all an illusion. It's all like a paper kite. There's no real power, no real control, just the power we let it have. In reality, we give paper power, but it is fragile, and the poem ends with the image of how human life, a different kind of tissue, is similar, powerful but fragile. In The Emigre by Carol Rumans, the narrator speaks about a country she left as a child, but she still remembers very clearly. The speaker never saw it in difficult times, and even the worst things she hears about it now don't stop her thinking positively about it. There may be a war there, it might have been invaded by evil people, but the speaker cannot think of it as anything but positive. The white streets of that city and the slopes glow even brighter as time goes by. Divisions rise between where the speaker currently lives and where she used to live. The speaker's country is an amazing place, but she doesn't have a passport. She can't go back, but the speaker's memories will stay with her. Checking Out Me History by John Agard is a poem about identity. In a BBC interview, Agard said that he was reading a history textbook in school and it contained a sentence that was something like this: West Indian history begins in 1492 with the arrival of Columbus. When he read this line, it got him thinking about how education has a Eurocentric view. Nothing exists until the Europeans have entered the arena of history, and how the retelling of history really depends on who is telling the story. In the poem, the narrator talks about how he was only taught about British history, dates like 1066, folklore like Dick Whittington, and historical figures like Lord Nelson. What he was not taught about was his Caribbean heritage, and in this poem he lists some figures from diverse backgrounds: Nanny de Maroon, Mary Seacole and others. By the end of the poem, the speaker's looking into his own history and carving out his own identity. Kamakazi by Beatrice Garland presents a mother talking to her children about her own father, a kamakazi pilot. She explains how her father left at sunrise. He took some water and a samurai sword in the cockpit of his plane. He had a shaved head full of strong ideas and only enough fuel in the plane to go to his destination, not to return. He was going on a one-way journey into history, but halfway there the daughter imagines, when later telling her own children the story, the pilot must have looked down at the fishing boats and the beauty of nature. It must have reminded him of his own childhood, playing on the shore with his brothers whilst waiting for their father to come back from fishing, and with that in mind the kamikaze pilot turned the plane around and came back from his mission. Filled with shame at his actions, the pilot's wife never spoke to him again or even looked at him. Everyone treated him as shameful. His children also eventually learned to be silent, to treat him as if he wasn't there. This was not the man they had once known and loved. The pilot must have wondered whether kamikaze death would have been better than this emotional death. This poem shows an inner conflict between the cultural, military and national expectation that he would commit suicide as a kamikaze pilot and the pilot's own desire to return home.